About a week or so ago, I was talking with someone about the weather in Wyoming. And I stated that spring was June, summer was July and August, fall was the first few weeks of September, and everything else is winter. But I read a story that my wife showed me a month or so ago about a family that lived in perpetual winter for 40 years. Now, this is not a family living in a nice, comfortable house with heating and with insulated walls. This was a family that lived in a lean-to type shack in Siberia. This was a family that lived out open to the elements. It was not until a team of geologists was surveying this incredibly remote area of northern Russia that this family, the Lykovs, were found. A people that were forgotten by their community, a people forgotten by the Russian government, and a people almost forgotten by time itself. The story comes from the Smithsonian Magazine. The old man's name was Karp Lykov. He was an old believer, a member of a fundamentalist Russian Orthodox sect, worshiping in a style unchanged since the 17th century. Old believers had been persecuted since the days of Peter the Great, and Lykov talked about it as though it only happened yesterday. For him, Peter was a personal enemy and the Antichrist in human form, a point that he insisted had been amply proved by the Tsar's campaign to modernize Russia by forcibly chopping off the beards of Christians. But these centuries-old hatreds were conflated by more recent grievances. Karp was prone to complain in the same breath about a merchant who refused to make a gift of 26 poods of potatoes to the old believers sometime around 1900. Things had only gotten worse for the Lykov family when the atheist Bolsheviks took power. Under the Soviets, isolated old believer communities that had fled to Siberia to escape persecution began to retreat even further away from civilization. During the purges in the 1930s, with Christianity itself under assault, a communist patrol had shot Lykov's brother on the outskirts of their village while Lykov knelt working beside him. He had responded by scooping up his family and bolting into the forest. That was in 1936. There were 4 Lykovs then: Karp, his wife Akulina, a son named Savin who was 9, and Natalia, their daughter, who was only 2. Taking their possessions and some seeds, they retreated even deeper into the taiga, building themselves a succession of crude dwelling places until at last they fetched up in this desolate spot. 2 more children were born in the wild. Imagine that. 2 children born in this lean-to shack in the wilderness of Siberia. Dmitri in 1940 and Agafia in 1943. Neither of these youngest Lykov children had ever seen a human being that was not a member of their immediate family. All that Agafia and Dmitri knew of the outside world, they learned entirely from their parents' stories. The family's principal entertainment was for everyone to sit around and recount their dreams to one another. The Lykov children knew there were places called cities where human beings lived in tall buildings. They had heard there were countries other than Russia, but such concepts were no more than abstractions to them. Their only reading matter were prayer books and an ancient family Bible. Akulina had used the Gospels to teach her children to read and write using sharpened birch sticks dipped in honeysuckle juice as pen and ink. When Agafia was shown a picture of a horse, she recognized it from her mother's Bible stories. Living on the edge of famine, disease, and the ever-present threat of the harsh environment, the Lykov family managed to survive from 1936 until 1978 without seeing anyone from the outside world. Unfortunately, after reestablishing their connection to the outside world, the family members slowly began to die off, one by one, until finally there was but one left, Agafia, living alone in a simple hut deep in the taiga of Siberian Russia. And to this day, no one is sure whether she's still there or not. Our psalm today, Psalm 13, has a title. If you read it in the Common English Bible and in other versions, it says, "For the Music Leader, Song of David." Perhaps this was written by David. Perhaps it's a story about David's life. No one really knows, but what we do know about this psalm is that it is one of trial and heartache. It is one that cries out from the face of great pain and difficulty. It is one that the Lykov family would be able to identify well with, having suffered all that they suffered and lived through all that they lived through. It's, in short, a lament. Now, what is a lament? Well, one theologian says it's this: lament is not despair. It's not whining. It's not crying into a void. A lament is a cry that's directed to God. It is a cry of those who see the truth of the world's deep wounds and the cost of seeking peace. It's the prayer of those who are deeply disturbed by the way that things are. If we are to participate in God's plan to reconcile all things in Jesus Christ, we need to learn to listen to this cry. A lament, in other words, is a recognition that something is wrong, whether it is with us or with another. It's a recognition that we're directing toward God, in essence, agreeing with God that these circumstances are damaging, that they're hurtful to ourselves and to others. It's an expression of passion and compassion, where we see the suffering within ourselves and within others and call it what it is before God. As Rolf Jacobson says, Psalm 13 is a prayer for when the bottom drops out. Laments and psalms, seeking God's help, like Psalm 13, make up 1/3 of the psalms in the Psalter. Now think about that. 1/3 of all the psalms are laments. They are cries to God for help. They are cries to God for His presence in the face of difficulty. Consider that 1/3 of those psalms, if you think about that, that's like saying 1/3 of the spiritual life of Israel was spent in lament. Think about our own lives. Think about how we live and the things that we experience. Would you say 1/3 of your life is lament? Would you say that you spend 1/3 of your life grieving, in pain, hurting for yourself or for others? That's a large part of who the Israelites were if their book of worship had that much space devoted to the idea of crying out to God in a lament. And yet, as we think about these psalms, this crying out for God and for His presence, these moments that are spent in pain and anguish when they are at their greatest, there's still buried beneath it, as we will see this morning, a hope that lies beneath the hurt. Psalm 13 is considered by many to be a model prayer in that it models the lament or the crying out prayers. Notice the first 2 verses of the psalm, the prayer, the song, have a repetitive phrase. How long? How long will you forget me, Lord? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I be left to my own wits, agony filling my heart? Daily? How long will my enemies keep defeating me? There's both a crying out and a challenge here. They cry out to God and say, how long? Forever? Daily? What kind of suffering am I in for here, God? Notice in each of these phrases, too, there's a certain fear that's being expressed by the psalmist. Being forgotten by God. Being out of God's presence. Being left to fend for themselves. And finally, being defenseless before a greater enemy. These are the fears of someone who is facing an adversary that is continually beating them. One that's mercilessly coming after them. Day after day. In these words, you can hear the fear and the frustration of one who feels that they have nowhere else to turn, no one else to go to. They're overcome by an enemy. They're beaten down by him. The next two verses find our psalmist moving from fear to this frustration, this maybe even this anger. Look at me. Answer me, Lord my God. Restore sight to my eyes. Otherwise, I'll sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I won. My foes will rejoice over my downfall. I want you to hear the emphasis I'm putting into this psalm, because when they wrote and they sang and they read these psalms, this was their emphasis. It was passionate. It was intense. It wasn't just, look at me. Answer me, Lord my God. Restore sight to my eyes. Otherwise, I'll sleep the sleep. That's not crying out. That's not a lament. A lament requires some pain and some passion. This is the Hebrew blues we're talking about. I mean, seriously. This is the Hebrew version of Howlin' Wolf, you know? Oh, Lord! I mean, this is what we're talking about here. I mean, you know, I'm not exaggerating. When we talk about someone crying out, we talk about them getting no response. These are demanding words. This is someone desperate to be heard, desperate to know that their cries are not unheeded. Not only do they cry out, but they offer some rationale as to why they're doing it. If not, I'm going to die, Lord. Not only that, but my enemy. They're going to assume they've defeated me. They're going to take pleasure in my death. By extension, the enemy's going to make fun of you, God, because your child has been overcome by them. They're going to think you're helpless, God. They're going to think you're just a facade, that you're not the Almighty we know that you are. Conversation is as much about who the psalmist thinks God is, and God should be in these moments of trial, as to what the enemy is doing and how the psalmist is reacting. I mean, if a God who cannot protect the sheep of his pasture from the hands of their enemies is not much of a God. And yet, do we really understand what that means? Do we really understand how we're being protected, what we're protected from? Or are we so afraid of suffering and of death that life loses its meaning in the face of it? I think it might be helpful for us to develop a theology of the dark night of the soul. Now, many of us are familiar with this phrase. It's a text that's written by St. John of the Cross, but more often than not, we know little about this book that he wrote. He wrote it in the 16th century, part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and yet it's still read rather fervently by both Protestants and Catholics alike. The richly symbolic book holds a poem about the soul that seeks to come to mystic union with God. The darkness in this poem is that of trial and of pain, but also of the unknowing as we journey with, to, and in the presence of God. Often we think what is not seen is not there, and yet we don't go looking for the air with a sense. It's not like we're looking around. I don't see any air. There must not be any here. It's not the same kind of thing. Barbara Brown Taylor writes this. She says, no one chooses the dark night. The dark night simply descends. And when it does, the reality that troubles the soul the most is the apparent absence of God. And yet, this absence that I believe the psalmist is speaking of in the first 4 verses of Psalm 13 may be seen as a great gift to us. It is, after the idea of St. John of the Cross, intended for our liberation. It's about freeing us from our ideas about God, our fears and misconceptions about God, our attachments to the benefits we think we're being promised for believing in God, our devotion to the spiritual practices that supposedly make us feel closer to God that are really nothing more than just empty actions. Our dedication to doing and believing all the right things about God, our positive and negative evaluations of ourselves as believers, our tactics for trying to manipulate God, our sure cures for doubting God. All of these become substitutes for God. In the words of John Wesley, we have a form of religion with no substance beneath it. This is why we are afraid. This is why when these difficulties come, we face them with fear and trepidation. There's a story about John Wesley, speaking of which, when he was crossing the Atlantic to come on a mission journey to Georgia, where he had intended to come and be the parish priest of the newly formed Georgia colony, along with James Oglethorpe and his brother, Charles Wesley. And as they got to, they got out into the Atlantic and started sailing, there was a terrible storm. And John was terrified for his soul. And he was afraid he was going to die. And he wasn't afraid, he was afraid he hadn't been good enough, hadn't been devoted enough to God. And he was scared to death. And as he sat there scared to death, this group, known as Moravians, started singing. And they were perfectly content. You imagine a ship that's being tossed about, thrown all over the place, and men running up and down the rigging and trying to hold the sails and hang on to the ropes and keep the ship on course. And everybody's terrified that the ship's going to sink. And yet here's this group of people just complacently singing, perfectly content, perfectly fine. Wesley went to the leader, Peter Bowler, and he asked him, how could you do that? In the face of all of that, how could you do that? His response was very simple. To paraphrase it, we know our God. We're not worried about what's happening because we know our God. We have nothing to be afraid of. We have nothing to be concerned of. We know our God. I think sometimes we have problems with this idea, peace in the face of such things, because the God that we have is a God of our own creating, a graven image of ourselves, of our culture, of our ideas that we can comfortably bow down to without losing any of our self-made, self-created identity. Ultimately, we must tear these down and replace them with something else. The one true God. But how do we know when we found the one true God and not another image created by ourselves? When the God we seek to worship is not a creation of selfish things. When the God we serve is not bound to our human weakness and our desires. When the God we bow down to is not born of our prejudices, our fears, our baser instincts and primal desires. In short, when we stop looking for our God and forcing an image to come into being and wait for God to be revealed to us, before us, and within us, then we can say with the psalmist, I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. Yes, I will sing to the Lord because he has been good to me. And no matter what happens to us, no matter what difficulties we face, what storms toss us about in the ship of life, we know this is true. Because we've had an experiential encounter with the Spirit of God. Because we know what it is to be in the presence of God. Because we know that even though we walk through the dark night, feeling forgotten and abandoned, we know we are not alone. We know that our God walks with us.